This is Reading at Homes with Holmes, Part 5, Chapter 5. Last time we had Cyril volunteer for the summary. Oh, that's a really cute cat. Cyril was in charge of the summary, so Cyril, are you just going to read it? Do you want to screen share it? How do you want to do that?
Sorry, I read what?
Your summary.
Right, right. Uh, as I'm kind of just gonna wing it from the conclusion of the chapter, just kind of paraphrasing that as to Mike's idea. Thank you for that very much. If you have the conclusion of the last chapter, feel free to pull it up, but it's whatever.
I do have it, so I will. And you know how to annotate, right? So
What?
you want to, when you draw on the screen. So
Oh,
if there's
right,
something you want
right,
to
right,
highlight, just go ahead.
right. Sure, I guess. So from what I got from down to here, um, was that the left hemisphere is a lot more focused on um, what is and kind of doing things with the end goal. Um, yeah, and something that has a purpose. If something doesn't have a purpose, it kind of undermines it a little bit. That's yeah, and then delete that. But then from here to here, I was completely lost, as Lisa knows. I genuinely did not understand this part. Had it explained, reread like 5 times. Just couldn't figure it out. So I apologize. I don't really have a summary of that. If anyone wants to jump in and try to explain it.
We can go over that after.
All
Let's
right.
keep going what you understand, and then we'll come back to that. And I see Dad nodding because I know he'll jump in on that.
Right, right. And then can I just read it?
If you want to read it and then do a little synopsis after, yeah, let's do that.
All right. I'll start from if right here.
Okay.
Okay, okay. If one had to encapsulate the principal difference in the experience mediated by the two hemispheres, their two modes of being, one could put it like this. The world of the left hemisphere, dependent on denotative language and abstraction, yields clarity and power to manipulate things that are known. Fixed, static, isolated, decontextualized, explicit, disembodied, general in nature, but ultimately lifeless. I think I'll stop there. And so I guess this would be, I say like most people's, well, no, actually, never mind, let's not go there. I don't know what to say to that, but this would be kind of most, I guess, the basic way of thinking, I'd say. From here going on. The right hemisphere, by contrast, yields a word of individual, changing, evolving, interconnected, implicit, in or incarnate
Mm-hmm.
living beings within the context of the lived world, but in the nature of things, never fully graspable, always imperfectly known, and to this world, it exists in a relationship of care. The knowledge that is meditated by the left hemisphere is knowledge within a closed system. It has the advantage of perfection, but such perfection is bought ultimately at a price of emptiness or self-reference. So I guess that'd be like a thought without, or I guess an example of this, from what I understand, would be like um, doing something like perfectly by the books, but not really thinking about what you're doing.
Hmm.
That's right or not, but That's kind of the way I understand this.
That's a good example.
It can meditate knowledge only in terms of mechanical rearrangement of other things already known. It can never really break out to know anything new because its knowledge is of its own representations only. I don't really know what that's supposed to mean. Sorry.
There's no apology necessary.
Yeah, no, it's okay. This is a good intro to like get into some dissecting and questions. So just keep going with the context, and then we'll go from there.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Where the thing itself is present to the right hemisphere is only represented by the left hemisphere. Now we come an idea of a thing, where the right hemisphere is conscious of the other, whatever it may be. The left hemisphere is conscious of itself. So for this, I don't know.
It shows that you're understanding it more than you think you are because you're using your right brain. And remember, it doesn't always speak in language, right?
And having the context I do about you, Cyril, I know that every time you read something, you're trying to look for a real life example that you can identify with, which makes perfect sense because that's how you come to understand things. So we can come back and I definitely know Dad's going to have a couple things where he can give you ideas to draw on, but you're already getting the idea like what Nate said. So do you want to continue reading just this last bit here?
Sure, why not?
Okay.
And this brings us finally to, And this brings us finally to the third question I asked at the outset in this chapter. Can all this tell us something about the nature of the brain? I think so. That answer is implicit in all that has gone before. There is no such thing as the brain, only the brain according to the right hemisphere and the brain according to the left hemisphere. The two hemispheres that bring everything into being also inevitably bring themselves like Escher's hands. So to some people, the brain is a thing and a particular type of thing, a machine, which is only to say that it is something we understand from the bottom up and which exists for a purpose we recognize. To others, it is something the nature of which is unique, which we can understand. Therefore, only by being content with a degree of not knowing, which opens the mind to whatever is, and whose purpose is not easily determined. In other words, we should expect that some people will be confined to it.
Confident.
Oh, right. Confident that they know precisely what sort of thing the brain is, while others may know precisely little about that. Yeah, so that's the conclusion to chapter 4. I apologize for not understanding it. So give context to it.
All right, we'll scroll back a little bit so
Okay.
we can kind of help him along for where he went. So when you're looking at, because one of the paradoxes that Gilchrist wants to present and solve for all those that are reading this book is not to get caught up on the dichotomy, right? This is going to be, think of this like a metaphor, right? For like know thyself, understanding, right? If you know the brain, then it gives you better equipment to be able to negotiate who you are, because who you are from the left hemisphere's point of view and who you are from the right hemisphere's point of view are two drastically different perspectives. So this conclusion is just trying to sort of set the stage for that. When you're looking down at the left hemisphere is always engaged in a purpose, it always has an end in view, and downgrades whatever has no instrumental purpose in sight. So it's myopic. It's myopic in its perspective, and it only knows what it knows as a representation, which gets mentioned a little bit later on down below. So where that presentation comes from, as we'll learn and you'll see throughout the entire book, is from the master. Hence why you're given the master and the emissary as a parable, if you will. So and then the right hemisphere, by contrast, has no designs on anything. It is vigilant for whatever is, without preconceptions, without a predefined purpose. So now an example of this for yourself, Cyril, say for example, when we all go out camping together, there is the general purpose, and the left hemisphere knows that we're going camping, we're going to go to a particular place. There's going to be some fundamentals that we need to have in order for the camping experience, right? So think about, like, your basics, food, water, shelter, that kind of stuff. So right then and there, just in how I described it, that would be like the left hemisphere's list. And you were right when you were saying doing something by the book, right? You make a list of stuff before you go camping. But essentially, what is actually the joy of the camping experience? And that is the unknown factors that then materialize for you in the experience. The camaraderie, the conversation, sitting around the fire, all going out for dips in the river, and then there's this experience. Now, you never know ahead of time how that's going to manifest and how it's going to play out. You might have a relative idea, and so that's like it's another form of a generalization. But the right hemisphere works with that openness to all that is, without it necessarily being defined or pinpointed by the left hemisphere. So that's kind of what actually is being presented there. Does that kind of make sense? Okay.
Yeah.
I would add one thing to what you said, and that's attention.
I concur with the modes of attention. I was just looking to try to help facilitate Cyril through his synapses. I agree wholeheartedly on that. That also gets addressed throughout the entire. That ultimately is one of the fundamental goals that is trying to be demonstrated by Gilchrist. It's it's a big part of the riddle to be solved.
Because I was maybe I was just tired, and I was trying to read some of the early chapters, and maybe they were just difficult. I did not have a clue, and I kept trying to figure it out as I was reading. And the more I tried, the more tired I got. And so I took a little nap, and then and then when I was waking up, I was like, I don't know if I understood it or not, but I was paying attention, and it was just so much. Just the act of paying attention was like, oh, so that's how I don't have to try to use my left brain to understand it. I just pay attention, and it starts to come together more. And that's the exciting thing of the attention. So that's all I'll say.
No, that's relatable when because you also follow Matthew and Cynthia's work. And when I first got into their podcast, I think the first podcast I did with Matthew was MLK one, and it was just on standard Canadian history. But I didn't understand a lick of it. He named 70 individuals I'd never even heard of. And I was like, I don't know how I'm ever going to understand this history thing. But then I decided time, context. I may not know analytically every timeline and every event he's alluded to, but the more I listen and the more I read, the context will start coming together. I just need to keep my attention, like you said, in it. And then eventually things started to click. Dad, if you want to continue off on some of the examples.
I was just going to where it was that he was, feeling like wanted to have an example brought up that he could wrap his head around. So there's a signature here where it says, if one had to encapsulate the principal differences in the experience mediated by the two hemispheres, their two modes of meaning could be put like this: the world of the left hemisphere dependent on denotative language and abstraction, clarity, power to manipulate things that are known, fixed, static, isolated, decontextualized. So all of this is control, ultimately, because it has a very self-centered purpose. It's one of the things that's necessary for being able to make specific distinguishing notations about the world around you, like the bird that turns its head to be able to get the craw, the specific of what it's trying to find in something on the ground, whereas the right hemisphere is busy looking out for all that could also happen to the bird. And that's why it says the right hemisphere, by contrast, yields a world of individual, changing, evolving, interconnected, implicit, incarnate living beings. So it has a greater grasp for the reality of life, whereas the left hemisphere has a greater grasp for the reality of systems and being able to almost like gaming life. So it ends up being sort of more reliant on the map and territory of the world. But the thing is that the lived experience isn't a map. Like a map is more like a guide, but you still have to then go and engage with the world, and that's the right hemisphere's wheelhouse. Whereas designing the map for information in order to better navigate the real world, it's kind of like tell me a civilization that got built without a tape measure, right? So left hemisphere gives you your tape measure. Right hemisphere gives you the desire to build something because it makes everything better. But once again, it doesn't get specific on how to build the thing. And that's where your left hemisphere comes into play. So that's just a living example there. Sorry?
Mike, is that true? The mapping is left hemisphere?
Yeah, that map. Yeah. Like given like topography. Yeah. Yeah, that's why one of the first things that you read in the beginning of the whole book, when Gilchrist makes a reference to, he kind of gives what would be the dogma, the standard mindset in mainstream about what they believe the left and right hemispheres do, and he had said that would all be fine and dandy if it wasn't entirely wrong. So one of the things that we have to do when approaching Gilchrist's work, kind of like what Matthew and Cynthia also encourage when you're looking at history, is if you don't come at it understanding the context of conspiracy, that we do that thing, right? Go plan a birthday party. That's conspiracy. Go attend a board meeting for a CEO's plan on launching a product. That's also a conspiracy. So when you ignore that, then you're not getting the true context of historical relevance. And so Gilchrist is saying with his work, he's offering an entirely different model of understanding and all the evidence that he can bring to bear, which I consider to be nomeological evidence, because it's so far from I'm on his next books, and it's irrefutable. So you have to reconsider what you thought you knew about left brain, right brain paradigms or axioms, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
Just when I'm thinking of the mapping, I guess, example and how I relate that personally to the left hemisphere is that sometimes I feel like when you're looking at a horizon and you're looking at a sunset, the sunset is like the primary focus. It's right there in front of your face. And I feel like that's what the left hemisphere is focused on, is what is its immediate attentional focus, consciousness right there in its face. But I think that everything that is surrounding the roundness that encapsulates an entire horizon and landscape is also not what's right in front of you, but what's behind you, what is in your peripheral vision as well. Like everything surrounding the focus point. And I think that everything surrounding that focus point is what the right hemisphere is trying to, I guess, keep into consideration, even if you're not necessarily consciously left hemispherically aware, it's keeping into consideration, you know? And so I feel like when we talk about the map example, when you have a map, you have all these little pinpoints of where you think that everything is like supposed to be laid out and all that, right? So that's a bit of the left hemisphere where it's got it figured out. It feels like this is what it looks like, right? But then the right hemisphere would be more of when you're actually walking the terrain and all the little intricacies of what made that landscape, of what made that map. That's what it accounts for, is everything surrounding the trail. Just this, it's not just where it leads and not just where it comes from. It's responsible for if there's anything like an unproven factor, if there's something else, if there's something more.
The only reason I brought that up, Macy and Mike, is partly because the thing that really helped me understand things a little better was kind of rooting McGilchrist's conversation in Platonic thinking of like being and becoming, principle and attribute. And in that sense, I was that sort of mapping with that relationship of principle and attribute. It really helped me understand the right and left brain differences.
Yeah, no, that's very true. One thing that I know even Kyle really enjoyed going into this, is like you learn about the different philosophies and the hemispheres, and then we went into Matthew's work, and then he talked about Plato versus Aristotle. And Aristotle is clearly a left hemisphere philosopher versus Plato, which embodies more right hemisphere. So it's like that's a good dichotomy. Even though it's not a dichotomy, it's a good beginner to get you into the mode of attentions of each when they're separate.
They get into this a bit more in the next chapter, but it also seems to involve a 2D versus a 3D view of the world. So for example, if you're in a history class in university, you'll see some people that'll write down all the different names and dates of when everything happens, but they have no context. It's a list that they've committed to memory, versus the people that understand these historical figures in the context. They almost bring them to life in their way they're presented in their mind. So that would be more like the right hemisphere view, whereas the people that are making the list of names, dates with no life to it, like McGilchrist says, that would be more like your left hemisphere.
Yeah, like when you see Matthew weave together history, he makes a good point of creating the drama of it, right? Letting it be a lived universal thing. And that's a very right hemisphere approach to history.
Yeah, absolutely.
It keeps in context that you're literally a part of it. You're living history right now.
Anyway, I think that lands us with a decent synopsis of kind of where we were in chapter 4. Let's move forward. Let's head into chapter 5.
Okay. Do we have anybody that wants to be the first share of the day?
I can probably find one or two at least I could share. Okay.
Which page?
I believe it's on page 177. If you look at the bottom of the screenshots. Yep, that's the one.
Okay.
Straight lines such as the horizon are curved if one takes a longer view, and space itself is curved, so that the rectilinearity of the left hemisphere is a bit like the flat earther's view. That's the way it looks here and now. I would say that the shape, not just of space and time, but of our apprehension of them, is curved, beginning in the right hemisphere, passing through the realm of the left hemisphere, somewhere in the middle, and returning to that of the right hemisphere. Reality has a roundness rather than a rectilinearity, a theme I will return to at the end of the book, which I found that interesting for two reasons. One being it gets into the overarching theme of the chapter as I saw it, the idea of starting with the right hemisphere, the master, sending whatever it perceives in context over to the left hemisphere to grasp it in stasis, and then returning it to the right hemisphere to return to that context. And the second thing is, it's interesting we see that on a mathematical perspective too. If you have any curve, if you bring it down to the curve down to a small enough scale, it's going to appear like a straight line, which is kind of like what the left hemisphere does. It takes the big overarching curve and shrinks it down to the finest infinitesimal detail. And at that point in stasis, it looks like a straight line. If you never return back to the larger picture of the curve, it's always going to look like a straight line. So I found that pretty interesting.
Yeah, I think he said something about, it was right here, that it's just before this, and it connects to that. Well, I guess I could read it. It says, and the left hemisphere's version of reality works really well at the local level, the everyday, which we are focused by habit. They're Newtonian mechanics rules, but it frays at the edges once one pans out to get the bigger picture of reality at the subatomic or at the cosmic level. Here, uncertainty replaces certainty. The fixed turns out to be constantly changing and cannot be pinned down. Straight lines are curved. In other words, Einstein's laws account better than Newton's. Surprise!
Yeah, because Newton's laws are only in one specific context, which is our context that we can relate to on a human scale. But when we get to scale of galaxies or to subatomic scale, it totally falls apart.
Well, it's just it lacks a vertical contextualization. Well, I was reading in chapter 3 about how you can have a sense of a hierarchical sense in the left hemisphere, and a striving for that, but without the contextualization of the vertical, everything just becomes flat.
Mm.
or a straight line kind of a deal. And so, yeah. And so we all need that. We need that master in ourselves. We need that yearning for that hierarchy, our hierarchical contextualization for meaning. Because otherwise, I'll be sitting here going, "Am I the baddies? Am I the baddies? I don't know."
True. That's so true. And it's funny because the answer is in part yes, because we all,
Yeah,
right?
right. Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
one of our new
That's
favorite sayings in the household. We always describe everything. It's like it's in part. It is partly true because there's so many different aspects to one thing. But Macy, go ahead.
Like
It would be better to say, it would be better to say in context, because the left hemisphere does divide everything into parts and can't see the whole.
No, you're so right. I definitely would say that it's in context, because even like when you see divisions in nature, even in the level of right hemisphere, left hemisphere, which we're going to be, that is a division in and of itself, right? And that comes down to kind of what you were talking about in terms of mode of attention, right? Because there's different ways that we approach these things. And clearly there's a fundamental natures to, well, we just do a thing, right? But when we also see divisions in nature, like I know that I would lean more towards the premise of like good and evil. It's not a clear-cut line, because the minute that you shift context, then it becomes something different, right? Because it's like I would consider it probably evil to like kill somebody, right? Or like a small dog. This sounds terrible. But like the minute that the shift of context changes, where I'm threatened, where my entire family is going to get killed if I don't do this thing, then the line becomes a lot more harder to define, because I'm like, well, I don't want this thing to happen. And that's where the paradox of that like sentiment, where it was like, okay, so you have a group of people on one railway and one person on the other, and who are you supposed to save, right? That's that negotiation of the hemispheres is like, right? Because at one point you'll have your left that's like utilitarianism, where it's like, well, I think that you should probably save like more, the other people, because you know there's more of them and that's useful, right? But then the other right hemisphere perspective is like, but that other person that we could potentially be killing is full of potential, and we don't know what it would mean if they were gone. You know what I mean? So.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just giving everybody a heads up. If you do have a screenshot that jumps out at you and you're like, oh, part connected, just interrupt. Let me know. Otherwise, I will bring up what I have, because I have plenty.
In the actual book, it's page 178. Just look for the subsection further evidence for the primary role of the right hemisphere. I'm going to read like the first half of that. It's not a long section. You're at the top there.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. In fact, we have already touched on a number of reasons for supposing that the right hemisphere plays a primary grounding role in the relationship between the hemispheres. There is the primacy of broad, vigilant attention. Though focused attention may appear to its owner to be under conscious control, in reality, it's already spoken for. We direct attention according to what we are aware of, and for that, we need broad right hemisphere attention. Then there is the primacy of wholeness. The right hemisphere deals with the world before separation, division. Analysis has transformed it into something else, before the left hemisphere has re-presented it. It is not that the right hemisphere connects, because what it reveals was never separated. It does not synthesize. What was never broken down into parts, it does not integrate. What was never less than whole. It reminds me of last chapter when we were talking about unconcealing truth, and I kind of had a thought that it almost feels like almost the left hemisphere would view it that way, because the unconcealing process of the truth, the process is a right hemisphere part, but the right hemisphere never breaks it down out of the wholeness. The context was already there. You just ended up having to go find it. It was your perspective that was shifted. It's like if removed from context, like why is a picture worth 1,000 words? It's because there's a context behind it, right? Why is talking about a song not the same as having somebody listen to the song? Why is poetry and metaphor so rich compared to like logical analytic thinking? It's just the context, the wholeness. You never have to break it down. Like you lose poetry in music, you lose the depth to it if you break it down analytically, and it no longer has the same effect. So,
because context is, been kind of can also be broken down into parts without describing the relationship to truth. And so it can, like postmodernism is all about decontextualizing it, or contextualizing everything ad infinitum to some kind of nihilistic, there's no, everything's relative, and we flatland. So it's like there's so many.
Well, I think you could view the postmodernists as also decontextualizing it to the point where you get so like left hemisphere focused on a particular thing that you throw away all other truths that could potentially be true for the convenience of getting to stand on whatever ground you want to in the moment. So you're throwing away all this context just so that you can be right in any given particular.
Putting everything into context in order to prove that the context is infinite and that there is no context ultimately, which is a real leap. But
how does one come to know that the context that you're perceiving is the actual context that exists? For example, let's take somebody who's part of the anti-racist movement. Their context is that all cops and white people are out to kill them with the black people. Now, that's the context that they're living in. That's the context that informs all their decisions, but it's not a true context. So is that context a product of the left hemisphere, or is it a misguided interpretation by the right hemisphere pinging over to the left hemisphere?
It's an incomplete model. So think of it as in its short-sighted context, which that just in and of itself, the way I just described it, is that's the signature of the left hemisphere. So they're taking small amounts of information to try to make a broader context. Well, that's a representation using small amounts of information. So it's like on the rigs, we say it's your lie. You can tell it as big as you want. Well, that just so happens that that's exactly what the left hemisphere does. It confabulates. So you can, it's almost like you're being polite by saying that it's a context for that individual. That's just not true. Like that's incomplete, that model.
For sure.
Well, also, I also feel like it just doesn't take into account reverse correlation, because sure, that could very well be their context, but then like I feel like this might be like my math brain, but it's like reverse correlate. Like out of all the how many times have you gone through an engagement and an interaction in your life, or have not gone through actually, because you're not even accounting, you're only accounting for what you've gone through, but actually what you have not gone through, which is when you're not getting segregated against, and actually it is the other opposite group that you actually think wasn't and was getting it easy, and they actually weren't, but you're not looking out for that because you're only looking for that which you want to suit your confirmation bias. So sure, context, but not really, because again, incomplete, because you're not doing the right hemisphere take into consideration that which you do not know.
So there's depth of there's in the right hemisphere, there's depth of relationship between context in order to see a larger picture regarding the information that's coming in, or the information from the universe, whether it's consciousness or not. Well, it must be to some degree.
Maddie, do we want to go to the primacy of unconscious will? Just because he's talked about consciousness now, and I really, really want to touch on the unconscious realm.
You can start reading, because I did have this screenshot. So read this, and then I stop right here. Life is conscious at all. And then we can, I know people are going to have something to say about it, and then we'll continue on, because I have another screenshot right after that, but we'll go in increments.
Okay, sure. Okay, some now famous experimental work by Benjamin Libet, published in 1985, attempted to investigate the conscious will from a neuropsychological point of view. Libet asked subjects to make spontaneous movements of their fingers at will, and recorded what was going on in the brain by monitoring the accompanying okay, how do you say this? Electroencephalographic data?
Electroencephalographic. electroencephalographic data.
Okay. Recorded by electrodes on the scalp. He confirmed earlier findings of a German neurologist, Hans Kornhuber, who had shown that there is a blip in the trace known as a readiness potential, about a second before the movement takes place. But much to his amazement, he discovered that the conscious urge to move the finger occurred not before, but ultimately 0.2 seconds after the readiness potential. In other words, the brain seemed to know in advance that its owner was going to make a decision to carry out an action. This clearly doesn't square with the common sense notion that we make a conscious decision to do something and has cast doubt in some minds on free will, giving rise to an extensive philosophical literature of debate. As Susan Packett puts it, some of Libet's research results seem to deny to consciousness any major role in the conduct of our day-to-day affairs. Quite so. But as one of the contributors to this debate points out, this is only a problem if one imagines that for me to decide something, I have to have willed it with the conscious part of my mind. Perhaps my unconscious is every bit as much me. In fact, it had better be, because so little of life is conscious at all.
Yeah, that's a heavy punch in the face. I mean, it's so relatable though, because I mean, where do you think intuition comes from and stuff like that? Or even as an artist, it's like he talks about truth in the earlier chapters, including chapter 3, chapter 2, and he talks about how it arises, it erects from within us. Well, that's not a conscious decision. I didn't choose for my gut and my intuition to tell me that that's a negative individual. You know, that's something that comes from within, and it sprouts, unfolds, as McGilchrist likes to say. But just because I didn't consciously think about my intuition and enacting that, does that make it any less me? And even Macy, like I told you in the car, this section made me giggle because while I edit these videos, I go through it and I rewatch it. And every time I watch everybody speak, especially Macy, who's very verbose, you know, grandiose with her hands, like he said, gesture always comes first. The hand and the body paint the picture, and then the words always follow afterwards because the body knows where it wants to go. But again, so it's unconscious, but that doesn't make it not you. And that's
the answer to the question, though, is your intuition is the right hemisphere. Like your gut feeling, or when people feel like they're embodying a situation, it's the right hemisphere that is in touch with the entire context of the lived experience of the body. So you actually, that instinct is playing out without your ego of the left hemisphere needing to play a role in it at all, because that just is, regardless of whether or not you would like to bring the left hemisphere's specific mode of attention into the equation of what has just transpired.
Yeah, and a thing that would back that up is the fact that he said the right hemisphere has more access, not quicker access, but it has more access to the limbic system. So that intuition, which is definitely a bodily connection there, that's unconscious. You don't pick it. So people might get confused because remember that the left, you know, you have the frontal lobes, so both left and right hemisphere, but they are still both connected to the substructures of the brain. So the right hemisphere has contact with all of those bodily parts, which is mostly unconscious. You know, we don't think about the breathing and how we operate, the blinking, that stuff that just goes on automatically. So it's unconscious, but it's still us.
I would go on to maybe 188 because there's a good section that just kind of encompasses a bit of what we just said, and it starts with if what we mean by consciousness. Okay, I'll just go from there until seems not to be noticed. So, if what we mean by consciousness is the part of the mind that brings the world into focus, makes it explicit, allows it to be formulated in language, and is aware of its own awareness, it is reasonable to link the conscious mind to activity, almost all of which lies ultimately in the left hemisphere. One could think of such consciousness as a tree growing on one side of a fence, but with a root system that goes deep down into the ground on both sides of the fence. This type of consciousness is a minute part of brain activity, and must take place at the highest level of integration of both brain function at the point where the left hemisphere, which in reality is in constant communication with the right hemisphere at the millisecond level, acts as a Thank you, interpreter. Not the only one that does the experiencing, mind you, but the one that does the interpreting, the translation into words. Note the significance of the metaphor. Meaning does not originate with an interpreter. All one can hope for from the interpreter is that in his or her hands, the true meaning is not actually lost. Why should we not be our unconscious as well as our conscious selves? Libet's experiment does not tell us that we do not choose to initiate an action. It just tells us that we have to widen our concept of who we are to include our unconscious selves. The difficulties seem to arise as so often because of language, which is principally the left hemisphere's way of constructing the world. It will be objected that what we mean by words such as will, intend, choose, is that the process is conscious. If it's not conscious, then we did not will it to happen. We did not intend it. It was not our choice. The fact that it is clear to us, to all of us these days, that our unconscious wishes, intentions, choices can play a huge part in our lives seems not to be noticed. So it's saying that like anything that has to do with will, intend, and choose, just because it's not necessarily conscious doesn't mean that your unconscious doesn't have the ability to intend, wish, and choose.
So like Mike, you were saying that unconsciousness is intuition?
No, I was saying that the
Oh,
right
sorry.
hemisphere is the soul of what we would consider to be intuition. So if you would like to be able to get a way of like sort of defining where does that intuition, like where's it come from? Like when you read The Matter with Things, which is the first of this 2-volume tome, he breaks down intuition in the Judgments chapter. That's for another conversation, or when we decide we're going to mess with that book. But just because what all too often is like intuition gets a bit of a bad rap from the left hemisphere's point of view, because the left hemisphere doesn't trust it. It doesn't trust intuition because it can't control it and it can't manipulate it. And so when it does, its version of intuition would be trying to formalize the right hemisphere's natural instinct. So for example, you see a snake in your low field of vision and your body reacts without you making a conscious choice. Like the world just imprinted on you and you had a response. There was an instinctual response. You had an intuition, or you know, there's you pass by the dark alley and you see a particular character that, you know, what is it about them that makes you get kind of the goose pimples, so to speak. And it's like, well, that might not necessarily, like your intuition says don't go down the alley because of that particular circumstance. That's like you putting your hand into a dark room. Your mind can fill up the room with all sorts of, you know, dangers and possible spiders and what have you, like in the middle of the night if you get up to go to the bathroom. But in all actuality, when you take in the full context, you know, your intuition is you're able to turn on the light and go pee and not stub your toe, and you know, like, yeah, these are just examples. That's all.
Okay, so the limbic system, the sympathetic system is tied into the fight or flight system is tied into the right hemisphere, and so
well, both hemispheres have access to it. The left hemisphere will get to it first before the right hemisphere will get to it, but the right hemisphere will bring more into the equation. And even though equation is a terrible word, but it's the one that I feel that I can use to try to help bring it to bear. Because remember, like, this whole thing is not about creating the dichotomy of constantly going like right hemisphere good and capable, left hemisphere bad and evil. And it's this is about understanding a whole that is you in the operation. That's why your answer of like, am I the baddie? Like earlier, your comment, it's like, the answer to that is at times, yes. But that doesn't encompass all of you, right? And we have to bear this in mind when we're trying to navigate ourselves in the world. And this is why we're studying the book. Like, why are we studying this material? Find a better version of ourselves through this stasis of literature, and we're looking for real life tangibles that we can draw, let the right hemisphere bring into the left hemisphere's field of view, so that we can analyze it with a little more scrutiny, and then add some scruples from the right hemisphere, and then it gets handed back over to the right hemisphere for the lived navigation, essentially, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does.
I know what I often forget that too, because there's a sympathetic system and the parasympathetic. Parasympathetic is the one with automated level control, and that one is typically associated with the left hemisphere. And then sympathetic, which is the one where, if something goes wrong, then that would be the right hemisphere. Chaos starts to come in, and then because the left hemisphere has to do with, like we said, local control, habitual things, anything that's familiar, so it can take control of your automatic functions. Whereas as soon as anything new comes into the picture, well, we know that the right hemisphere deals with everything and anything new, including bodily stimuli.
Well, that's why it brings up a different sensation even in your body. It's like, and different, I mean new, like something that is not habitual, because on the ordinary day-to-day of my life, I'm kind of just going through chilling. But if something happens where the other day I literally scared the shit out of myself, my heart races, something entirely, my whole body just goes into shock, and I'm like, whoa, and it's something new, right? And it's not like I kind of like willed that to happen, it just sort of happened.
Well, I was mentioning it because I noticed that I was in a I don't know if I want to say programmed. I was I was not aware that I was in a state of fear in life, that I was not trusting my intuition and my creativity. Aware of it. If you don't address it, then you don't face it.
Consider fear and anger, Nathan, as like the primary emotional manifestations that the left hemisphere has access to. So because there is a time to be afraid, right? And there's a time to be angry. But in all likelihood, you're going to run a reverse correlation. You're going to go through life, and if fear and anger end up becoming sort of the primary modes of being, then you're under what we would consider to be a proclivity for left hemispheric mode of attention on the world. And then that's what's going to be manifest, and that's what is stable, predictable, and controllable through the left hemisphere. And so it would almost prefer just operating on the simplicity of those two emotional dynamics than to take in the full encompassment and the risk that is associated with all the other emotional presentations that have too many facets that are not within the myopic control of the left hemisphere. Right. But that's where courage lives. That's where creativity lives. That's where music lives. That's where friendships and potential. I would say, like, if you would really like to summarize the primary mode of purpose in my interpretation of this work, is the right hemisphere is beholden to potential. And potential does not always manifest as a right or a wrong. That would be the left hemisphere trying to put a modality of how that plays out. Whereas the right hemisphere is like, well, no, just the absence of no allows things to play out. And then you need to respond, because you're a co-creator and a coexister within your own hemispheres, trying to work with the other hemispheres around you, let alone what the world will just bring to bear. So I don't know if that kind of helps you be able to.
It totally does, because I know that in my life I had periods where I had a lot of courage, but I ran up against things that were different and scary, and I decided to just try to make a living, focusing on survival and throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Just because there are what you said there about when you said you didn't know if how did the discernment between whether things are good or bad. That is an experiential knowledge that that is simply just has to be lived and to be understood and worked through.
I feel like for me, it's a negotiation, and I won't try and dwell on this too long, but like I relate to you very much, even though I'm very young. It's like I'm definitely, I would say, more at left hemisphere proclivity when it comes to anything that's new and uncomfortable and scary. I will get that initial like jerk of like, no, or fear or anything like that, right? But I think that what I guess helps is the fact that I constantly always did and sometimes still do try to go towards right and wrong. I always tried to figure out a formula for circumstances so I could put it in stasis to try and figure out what would be the perfect ideal person to be, what would it look like, and then it would turn into a big conglomerate of nothing, because it's like that process of you trying to figure out what perfection is for you is the perfect process. Right? And so it's like a imperfectly perfect, right? Because there is no such thing as I believe that it gets to that part in the book where there's no such thing as standing on a horizon that sees everything. So eventually, when it comes to truth as concealment or unconcealment, like when you choose to unconceal, you will conceal. And when you conceal, you also in some ways are unconcealing. And so, because it's a relationship of that push and pull. And I think that is always something that is a process, and it will manifest itself before you and you before it. And that's why I think the right hemisphere is very individualistic of, I guess, just paying attention to your circumstances in your life and your intuition with what it is that you're engaging with. And I don't necessarily mean like on a self-centered level. I mean on the level of like it's your journey, it's your story. So, and I always used to think, well, what's the perfect choice? And the truth is that there is no perfect choice, and yet they're all a perfect choice. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I do. And more, just real quick, just more specifically, developing more and more intuition. So what would you call exploring the right hemisphere's way of being and living, that doing more of that, more and more and more of opening up to experience and information?
No one formula to that question. How about this as an example? If you find yourself in whatever particular circumstances that are arising, and you're placing yourself in position to extend and rotate the circumstance more often, then you're starting to present what I would consider to be a wiser formula of the right hemisphere's way of engaging with the world. However, that's why you get the scrub nurse and the surgeon as another example. That's why Gilchrist uses these, because you have to understand that the master and his emissary, they're explaining the betrayal that the emissary will get to, because the left hemisphere is very selfish and the right hemisphere is very community possibility open, but not always getting specific, because there's so much potential in those things. So the reason why you get the doctor and the scrub nurse is an excellent metaphor for sort of like the lived presentation of the hemispheres, where the right hemisphere knows the potential of the left hemisphere's role in the symbiosis, and it would much rather not perform the operation as the doctor without the scrub nurse, because the chances of success for that operation as a whole, which is better for the patient and better for the reputation of the surgeon, that it goes off with the highest possible success, and potential can then be manifested into reality instead of just the what could be. And whereas the scrub nurse is actually not even capable of doing the surgery, but it thinks it can do the surgery because it's seen the doctor do it. And then it goes, well, I don't need the doctor, I can do it. Not even getting in the context that if you were going to be the doctor, you didn't even allow for the potential of asking the doctor to be your scrub nurse. So that's how self-centered the left hemisphere is. And that's why you get the master betrayed, because if you don't understand this part of yourself, you will betray yourself in circumstances more often than you'll realize if you're not letting the right hemisphere have that extend and rotate, and even at times maybe don't give an answer. Spend more time. There's another, in I think it was in last week's conversation where it was I believe we had talked about the fact that the right hemisphere will have a tendency to ask the devil's advocate questions more often. So that means that you have to give more time to the overall analysis. So that's how you avoid impulse buying. You know what I'm saying?
Well, it's because during developmental growth, particularly in early childhood, there's going to be neither prefrontal cortexes are really fully developed, and so there can be emotional issues that come up that can make the doctor suck and the scrubber suck. I'm just kidding.
Yeah, and that's in process though too, right? Like, why do teenagers get what's considered to be that teenage brain? Well, in all actuality, a huge developmental process of the left frontal cortex is coming online at that time. And what do you see? What do you see teenagers do? They spend more time looking in mirrors. Most of the conversation is still focused and centered around them. That's why they're easily weaponized. That's why they try to nail you even in university, because then the finishing up of the right frontal cortex starts doing its thing, but it's not quite finished yet. So it's easier to weaponize people. Like, make no mistake, our society knows this game. They know how to manipulate this work. We're trying to converse about it so that you know the magic trick that is your brain. And if you know the magic trick that's your brain, they can't play the game on you.
What I have pulled up here touches a little bit on that, and Carter, if you don't mind, do you want to pull it up in a book, or are you going to read off the screen? So it's what I have on the screen here, and when I scroll down, it literally stops right here of things.
Okay. Can you scroll up again and just keep scrolling as I read?
Yeah.
Okay, you want me to start from this idea?
Yeah, it touches on the things that Nathan and Mike were just talking about.
Sure. Okay. This idea is not only a philosophical insight that helps us to explain what we know of the worlds brought into being by the two hemispheres at the phenomenological level. Once again, we find it instantiated at the neurological level in the functional anatomy of the brain. Remember that the primary function of the corpus callosum is to act as a filter on transmission between the hemispheres, allowing communication to pass, but preponderantly acting to inhibit activity, thus shaping the evolution of unconscious experience, primarily the left hemisphere. But that is not all. The most highly evolved part of the brain, the frontal cortex, achieves what it does largely by negating or not negating other brain activity. The cortex's job is to prevent the inappropriate response rather than to produce the inappropriate one, writes Joseph Ledoux. That is, it pares down from among things that exist. It selects, it does not originate. And one answer to the problem raised for free will by Lebet's experiments is that there is time between the unconscious initiation of an action and its execution for the conscious mind to intervene and veto the action. In this sense, it may exert its influence more as free won't than free will. The frontal lobes are indisputably the parts of the brain that make us most human, that bring about for all the greatest things that we achieve. This negation is therefore hugely creative. When we remember that it is the right hemisphere that succeeds in bringing us in touch with whatever is new by an attitude of receptive openness to what is, by contrast with the left hemisphere's view that it makes new things actively, by willfully putting them together bit by bit, it seems that here too is evidence, if any further were needed, that the right hemisphere is more true to the nature of things. So what were your thoughts on that, Maddie, when you read it? Like, what stood out to you?
My favorite line was the it may exert its influence more as free won't than free will.
That was a
But
good one. I like that.
right? It's almost counterintuitive. I mean, it is and it isn't. There's the paradox there. When I read this, he describes truth, as Kyle alluded to, as an unfolding, an unconcealing. And then even here, free will acts as a free won't than free will, because creativity comes from negation. The hemispheres negate other parts to allow for other parts to, come into being. And I really appreciate that, because he has this constant theme of the whole is already there. And then it's about how they come into being, what attention arises. So it's how they end up commingling in the end, but they were already there. And that's something that really been only garnering on this time around reading it. I'm gaining new things, obviously, because I'm changing every time I read this.
Yeah, it's very cool that all this stuff is already residing in your unconscious mind, like your creativity, music, all this, and you can choose to turn it off, but it's more of a choice of inhibition or disinhibition rather than a conscious choice of the action. The unconscious, which was shocking to me, that only the latest studies are showing that 5% or less, and probably less than 1% of our brain activity is conscious brain activity. Most of this is taking place in the unconscious. So it makes total sense that our frontal lobe is responsible for choosing to shut that off or not to shut that off. But it's already there.
Now, does anybody have a screenshot that they want to pull up before I continue? Because I will continue this thing. Unless everybody's like, no, I have one fit in perfectly right here. Or maybe it didn't fit and you just want to bombard it and take us in a new direction, which is also fine.
We'll do both things at once. Go to page 184.
184. I like that.
So we're going to go to primacy of effect.
Okay.
Mhm. Yeah, all right. I will probably stop at well, I don't want to spoil actually where I'm going to stop, but we'll just go. So if the implicit grounds the explicit, it would imply that one's feelings are not a reaction to or a superposition on one's cognitive assessment, but the reverse. The effect comes first, the thinking later. Some fascinating research confirms that effective judgment is not dependent on the outcome of a cognitive process. We do not make choices about whether we like something on the basis of explicit assessment, a balance sheet, weighing up its parts. We make an intuitive assessment of the whole before any cognitive processes come into play, though they will, no doubt, later to be used to explain and justify our choice. This has been called the primacy of effect. We make an assessment of the whole at once, and pieces of information about specific aspects are judged in the light of the whole rather than the other way around. Though these pieces of information, if they are enough that do not cohere with our idea of the whole, can ultimately cause a shift in our sense of the whole. The implication is that our effective judgment and our sense of the whole, dependent on the right hemisphere, occur before cognitive assessment of the parts, the contribution of the left hemisphere. I would anticipate that, at some deep and fundamental affective level, the right hemisphere is more in touch with true inner feelings and less able to lie. Panskep's suspicion would be supported by the research evidence discussed in Chapter 2. While effect is not, of course, the same as value, like value, it is primary. not just derived from cognitive assessment, as the left hemisphere would have us believe when it retrospectively examines the process. And it was this insight that lay behind Max Scheler's importance concept of I don't know how to say that, precognitive apprehension of the value of something, its meaning for me. The disposition towards the world comes first. Any cognitions are subsequent and consequent on that disposition, which, in other words, affect. Affect may too readily be equated with emotion. Emotions are certainly part of affect, but are only part of it. Something much broader is implied, a way of attending to the world or not attending to it, a way of relating to the world or not relating to it, a stance, a disposition towards the world, ultimately a way of being in the world. I can keep going, but emotion is very important, and it too is closer to the core of our being than cognition. As Nietzsche wrote, thoughts are the shadows of our feelings, always darker, emptier, simpler. Several lines of reasoning from the evidence converge to suggest that the essential core of being is subcortical. Perceptual to cognitive awareness would appear to have developed on the back of affective awareness, which was a revolutionary prerequisite, writes Jack Panskep. From such a vantage, Descartes, is it Descartes or?
Yeah, Descartes. Yeah.
Descartes' faith in his assertion, I think, therefore I am, may be superseded by a more primitive affirmation that is part of the genetic makeup of all mammals. I feel, therefore I am. He later goes on in a footnote. The bottom line statement probably should be, I am, therefore I am.
You could keep going. I have this section here. Does anybody want to take over her reading?
Yeah, that's fine.
Sure,
I'm
I can read
Huckleberry.
through
Where
it.
are we going?
So emotion in the body, what's on the screen, and then the quote here. Yeah, that's the end of my screenshot.
That's such an important thing because feeling really drives the intuition. It's a real connector to the intuition.
I like that connector to the intuition. I like that.
I would reckon it more from my description of it would be it's a part of it, an important part of it. But that would still be incomplete on the whole because anyway. I have a tendency for right hemispheric proclivity of thinking, so I'm always unfortunately not unfortunately
I was trying to go
I'm
there,
I'm
and
a
you took me home.
contextual thinker. Yeah. So emotion and the body are at the irreducible core of experience. They're not there merely to help out with cognition. Feeling is not just an add-on, a flavored coating for thought. It is at the heart of our being, and reason emanates from the central core of the emotions in an attempt to limit and direct them, rather than the other way about. Feeling came and comes first, and reason emerged from it. Emotion has taught mankind to reason. As the 18th century French philosopher Vanagui put it, even the prejudice we have in favor of reason cannot itself be justified by reasoning. The virtues of reason are something we can do more than intuit. In his influential book, Descartes' Error, Damasio points to the primacy of emotion in neurological terms when he notes that the apparatus of rationality, traditionally presumed to be neocortical, does not seem to work without that of biological regulation, traditionally presumed to be subcortical. Nature appears to have built the apparatus of rationality not just on top of the apparatus of biological regulation, but also from it and with it.
We should go there next because it's really funny, how we get that from Damasio here. And I'm doing this because I'm reading about Edgar Allan Poe right now through Matthew's work, and he's talking about Immanuel Kant and how the transcendentalists really work off of the dichotomy of emotion versus reason. They play off the fact that emotion, there's nothing that reason can do that emotion can't first come about, which is a little bit, you get hints of that here. Yet again, it's like dichotomy where you lose people, because that's the one thing that I love about reading Matthew and Cynthia's work. more than once I've come across where there's a political or an oligarchical figure that they're criticizing, and rightfully so. Yet when you look at their work and what they're saying, just as is, there is part truth. It is incomplete, however, as Dad says. And I feel like McGilchrist's work really brings in that second half, which is it actually playing out into reality via the hemispheres.
Do you think Emerson was Ralph Waldo Emerson was willfully playing people like that, or did he really go to the nihilist, to the cult of death? No, was he aware of it? I mean, because I was really into Henry David Thoreau's writings and the Transcendentalists when I was younger, and I remember reading Henry David Thoreau word for word, just captivated by everything he was talking about, and you know, and
Well, when you say younger, Nathan, when you say younger,
yeah.
how old were you when you were enraptured by that work? How old were you?
14, 15, probably 15.
So
15.
This is actually what's intriguing is it his work that you believe that you need to be able to sift through, or more importantly, where was your mind at the time with its development and why it appealed to you? Because I think that there's more answers there than there is about whether or not we can find out the true motive. Because in most cases, right, there's that line that says, by your deeds, you will know them. I mean, people are very complex. So trying to look at somebody's work that they've written, I mean, he could have been trying to sift through ideas, even that in of itself, right? So more importantly, analyzing.
Thoreau, yeah, for sure Thoreau, but Emerson, boy, he trained with, according to Matthew's work, he was training in London with some pretty occult circles, and it was just like, wow. With Thoreau, I really, I was really different, lonely, and I wanted to kind of just go into my own world and of nature, and kind of, I didn't like a lot of the analytical thinking going around me. So I was vectored into certain rejections of exploring a deeper understanding through emotional escapism and also expression. But I'll have to think about that, obviously.
The reason that the question though, where your brain was at during that time is it's a good question, because the left hemisphere is primarily developing in the 14 to 15 age range. So mine is just almost kind of like on its way out the door, hopefully. But so when that happens, so the beautiful part that I feel like I've resonated the most about Gilchrist's work is that it gives me a bit more accountability to what's going on upstairs in my brain, because sometimes I can tell when I'm leaning more towards the values of the left hemisphere, where it's like utility and I just want like things in stasis and I want certainty, right? And then there's other times where I have that left hemispheric proclivity to beat on my left hemisphere, because I'm like, oh, I don't want to be always thinking in stasis, and I don't want to always be, there's got to be more and transcendental, and right. And so I feel like, just for the context of why I think the hemisphere work is like so important, and figuring out, well, where was your brain at the time, is because quite literally that changes the context and the shift, right? And that's why you'll go into it, you're in chapter 3, but he'll go into kind of trying to show a bit more of what can philosophy tell us about the hemispheres, but also what can the hemispheres tell us about philosophy. And when you get into that section, then it'll be a little bit less of when you're reading philosophical works and you're kind of feeling like you're getting caught in the weeds of like, I don't really know how I feel about all these different things. He will show how what it is that you're feeling and thinking and all that, right? It plays onto what the philosophers' hemispheres were doing when they were writing their philosophical piece. So it's that's like a little, there you go.
No, that plays perfectly. I pulled it up here and I want Kyle to read, but I know Kyle likes reading from the book. It's a little bit of an awkward start because it's kind of in the middle of a paragraph.
Okay, hang on, let me see. So nonetheless, Damasio, and what 85 on here.
So this observation brings me back. You go in a couple sentences, like actually one sentence
Found
in.
it. Nonetheless,
Yep.
Damasio does not. Okay.
Yeah, and then I'll tell you when to stop.
Just interrupt me because I won't be looking at the screen if you highlight it. All right. Nonetheless, Damasio does not appear to recognize the phenomenological primacy of emotion or effect. Instead, he sees emotion as auxiliary. They're to play a role in guiding the thinking being that we are, rather than seeking thinking, as they're to guide the feeling being that we are. Emotions, he insists, are not a luxury, as though such an idea could ever have occurred to anyone. Oh, sorry, I lost it. As if such an idea could ever have occurred to anyone in the light of experience, let alone of acknowledged primacy of effect. Emotions are not a luxury. Damasio goes on to reassure us because they are useful tools. They play a role in the communicating meaning to others, and they may also play the cognitive guidance role that I propose. Thus, emotions are there to serve as handmaiden to reason, playing a useful role in helping us communicate or possibly in weighing the products of cognition, but not at the irreducible core of experience of ourselves. In the process of trying to rehabilitate feelings by showing that they form, after all, a vital part of the cognitive process, Damasio inevitably does so by trying to make them explicit, measurable, quantitative, turning them into speed or an amount of mental associative processes, speed or an amount of motor behaviors, rather than qualitative. He also sees them, as William James did, as an interpretation of bodily data. In fact, he even states that regular feeling comes from a readout of the body changes. The inseparability of the body and emotion, not to mention effect, is interpreted in such a way that emotion ends up derived from the body by a readout, there to guide the cognition that is doing the reading. Apparently unaware that he is repeating Descartes' error, he writes, I conceptualize the essence of feelings as something you and I see through a window that opens directly onto and continuously updated image of the structure and state of our body. Once you are able to see your feelings through a window opening onto an image of your body, you have clearly far outstripped Descartes at his own game. I think
just the next sentence.
Okay. I think part of the difficulty here, which I will return to throughout this book, is that in the context of intellectual discourse, we are always obliged to look at the relationship of cognition to effect from the cognitive point of view.
And that's exactly what Macy just described. And it definitely goes into the question of, did Emerson, Ralph Waldo Emerson, was he, truly captured, or was he misguided? And the answer is a little bit of both. Even here, McGilchrist directly quotes Damasio in a sense to explain the whole, yet the overall philosophy of Damasio, as we just went into, was actually not explaining the thing that McGilchrist did. So that's the nuance of everybody, because it's the nuance of the hemispheres, and that there are prosets, it's a pinging. So although you may be on one page, one mode of attention one day, you come back to it, or you're influenced by other people at a later stage, and then it changes, even though you may have you have pieces of both modes of attention because you have both hemispheres. And then what Macy touched on is that last sentence, the fact that, talking about it, that's where you end up losing some of it. So although we can embody it and understand it just that way, doing the physical actions, we are limited by trying to verbalize it and then trying to come up and justify the reasons why we instinctively do this thing, which is what Macy always says is the realm of the left hemisphere, trying to explain why it is we do what we naturally do. Because otherwise, it doesn't see the utility. Why should I do this good thing if I don't know why we do this good thing? Realizing we're going to do it regardless whether you know why or not.
More importantly, that to be added to this, and this is why it's known as repeating Descartes' error. Because when you look at it, says apparently unaware that he is repeating Descartes' error, he writes, I conceptualize the essence of feelings as something you and I can see through a window. So the first thing there is a frame gets introduced. The left hemisphere will do that, right hemisphere won't do that, right? And then you continue on, right? Because this also gives you an understanding of which hemisphere is bringing the information into focus. Like for one, focus is the left hemisphere's wheelhouse, right? Anyways, but then opens directly onto a continuously updated image of the structure and the state of our body. So once you were able to see your feelings, the eyes being a focus, left hemisphere, right through a window. So now you got a frame opening to an image of your body, a representation. You have clearly far outstripped Descartes at his own game. And it's like, that's like embodiment, the left hemisphere. Because if you remember when I was reading from A Matter of Things and I was saying around the table, it's like the left hemisphere will actually offer an answer that it would say is an intuition, but it's not. It will confabulate about that which it cannot know. But it's gonna give you an answer regardless, and that's essentially, it doesn't understand the body, not as a whole. It doesn't understand feelings and emotions. It understands anger and it understands fear, right? Reactive, controlling, manipulating. But anyway, it's just something to bear in mind. That's why the mistake's made, is you're literally letting individuals, the left hemisphere is presenting its version of a right hemisphere naturalization.
Well, again, you're coming at it with the tools of the left hemisphere. It's like trying to, it's I think that it came up a couple of chapters ago where it's like trying to fly with a submarine. It's like you're trying to go into this not even go into this understanding. You're already in it actually. But what you're doing is you're trying to, I guess, be in it in a sense. I don't know if that's the correct word. Hence why I see language is tricky. But but what you're using is the tools of the left hemisphere to try and justify that which the right hemisphere is already doing. You know what I mean? It already just does a thing. We're doing the living life thing, and then the left hemisphere, like, hence why when that last sentence where it's like, he was like, it kind of sucks because what we're doing is we're cognizing. And what is that, right? And then you get stuck sometimes.
Yeah, but this section here goes right into that and then expands upon it further. It's funny because we've kind of been.
I have this one.
Oh, perfect. Okay, well, do you want to read it or shall I?
I think you should read it. You are a very good reader.
That is kind. Okay. The biggest problem of explicitness, however, is that it returns us to what we already know. It reduces a unique experience, person or thing, to a bunch of abstracted, therefore central, concepts that we could have found already anywhere else, and indeed had already. Knowing in the sense of seeing clearly is always seeing as something already known, and therefore not present, but represented. Fruitful ambiguity is forced into being one thing or another. I started this chapter by suggesting that because of its power to change, attention can also destroy. Many things that are important to us simply cannot withstand being too closely attended to, since their nature is to be indirect or implicit. Forcing them into explicitness changes their nature completely, so that in such cases, what we come to think we know, certainly, is in fact not truly known at all. Too much self-awareness destroys not just spontaneity, but the quality that makes things live. The performance of music or dance, of courtship, love, and sexual behavior, humor, artistic creation, and religious devotion become mechanical, lifeless, and may grind to a halt if we are too self-aware. Those things that cannot sustain the focus of conscious attention are often the same things which cannot be willed, that come only as a byproduct of something else. They shrink from the glare of the left hemisphere's world. Some things, like sleep, simply cannot be willed. The frame of mind required to strive for them is incompatible with the frame of mind that permits them to be experienced. As Montaigne wrote, even things I do easily and naturally, I cannot do once I order myself to do them with an express and prescribed command. The very parts of my body which have a degree of freedom and autonomy sometimes refuse to obey me if I plan to bind them to obligatory service at a certain time and place. What's true of making love and going to sleep is also true of things less physical. For example, attempts to be natural, to love, to be wise, or to be innocent and self-unseeing are self-defeating. The best things in life hide from the full glare of focused attention. They refuse our will.
I really like that part.
Yeah, that's really good. It kind of plays into what Christ says in the Gospels about whoever seeks to save his life will lose it, and whoever loses his life for my sake will save it. You almost have to let go of these things in order to actually get them. If you're seeking after them, they tend to slip out of your grasp, the grasp being the left hemisphere. But if you can let them be such as they are and attend to them with the right hemisphere, then at that point, then you can get the things that he talked about. You can get music, you can get creativity, you can get love, you can get wisdom. That's where that comes into play. But if you're actively seeking that and trying really, really hard to get it, it's probably not going to come to you.
Forget it.
Mm-hmm.
Carter, do you want to continue off of here?
Sure. Just from the top there on the screen.
Absolutely.
Alrighty. It is, however, precisely the left hemisphere's task to bring things into focus, to render the implicit explicit, in order that what is seen may become the object of our will. This is achieved by a certain kind of vision, since only vision of all the human senses can give truly detailed information and give clear pinpointing in space to guide our grasp. This clarity and fixity of the object is highly amenable to the worldview of the left hemisphere. In fact, it is only in the case of the left hemisphere, not of the right, that one can speak appropriately of a world view at all. But sight alone of all the senses also allows finely discriminated depth. As long as that depth is preserved, it yields for the right hemisphere engagement, betweenness. Shorten away, it allows precision focusing by the left hemisphere at a point in a two-dimensional plane. One is aware of this two-dimensionality, particularly when focusing a microscope or telescope. The resulting illusion is of clarity, the ability to know something just as it is, as though everything about it were revealed through clear vision. Depth is the sense of a something lying beyond. Another way of thinking of this would be more generally in terms of the ultimate importance of context. Context is that something, in reality nothing less than a world, in which whatever is seen inheres and in which its being lies, and in reference to which alone it can be understood, lying both beyond and around it. The problem with the attentional spotlight, as conventional psychological literature calls it, is that this isolation of the object of attention from its context, not just its surroundings, but the depth in which it lives, it opacifies it. Our vision stops at the thing itself. The price that the shearing away of the context produces something lifeless and mechanical. In a famous passage in the Meditations, Descartes speaks of looking from a window and seeing men pass in the street. Yet he reflects, do I see any more than hats and coats which could conceal automatons? I judge that they are men. It is not surprising that, shorn by the philosophic stare of all context that might give them meaning, the coats and hats that Descartes sees from his window walking about in the street could be animated by a machine.
And that brings us back to what Dad alluded to, why even the way that Damasio described the emotions in the frame of a window repeated the literal mistake of Descartes here.
And machines are the left hemisphere's best metaphor. So when you get individuals that start using, the brain's like a computer, it's like, oh yeah, Garbage in and garbage out, huh? It's just it's unfortunate, but that's the best the left hemisphere can do. That's why it's recognition or recognize. It's unfortunately it's an incomplete model, and this is one of the larger worries that Gilchrist tries to bring our attention to as a whole, because as you're going to find out later in the book, when you get to what does the world of the left hemisphere look like when it actually manifests into reality, and we look around at our society, and you're going to see that the hall of mirrors and the labyrinth is almost complete around us. The triumph of the left hemisphere, if you will.
Yeah, Dad, do you want to read what's on the screen here?
Sure. The illusion that if we can see something clearly, we see it as it really is hugely seductive. Ruskin in Modern Painters makes the point that clarity is bought at the price of limitation. We never see anything clearly. What we call seeing a thing clearly is only seeing enough of it to make out what it is. This point of intelligibility varying in distance for different magnitudes and kinds of things. He gives the example of an open book on an embroidered handkerchief on a lawn. Viewed from a distance of 1/4 of a mile, they are indistinguishable. From closer, we can see which is which, but not read the book or trace the embroidery on the handkerchief. As we go nearer, we can now read the text and trace the embroidery, but cannot see the fibers of the paper, nor the threads of the stuff. Closer still, we can see the watermark and the threads, but not the hills and dales in the paper's surface, nor the fine fibers which shoot off from every thread, until we take a microscope to it, and so on ad infinitum. At which point do we see it clearly? When, therefore, we say we see the book clearly, Ruskin concludes, we mean only that we know it is a book. Clarity, it seems, describes not a degree of perception, but a type of knowledge. To know something clearly is to know it partially only, and to know it rather than to experience it in a certain way.
I know, I love that part, because then the question would be like, so at what point are you seeing it for what it is? And the answer is at every point. You see it for what it is, not entirely in its fullness though, but yet in part.
Well, that's why in chapter 4, he talked about aspects. He's like, people look at a mountain and, you know, a painter sees an object to paint, bring to life, whereas somebody like a meteorologist or something looks at the sediment and what the material, what it's made of, depending on the amount of attention you brings out a different aspect of the mountain. And does that make those people right or wrong, you know, less or it's a different mode of attention, and it brings out different aspects, all of which could very well be, and that's the thing that, you know, the postmodernists that we talked about at the beginning, and Macy alluded to 1 or 2 of our sessions ago, what the solipsists and postmodernists always get wrong is the people. Although multiple people may have different perspectives, it's the shared truth in the end, which really, even good and evil, when Nathan and Macy were talking about it earlier, you know, people say it's so easy to determine good and evil, you know, we all just agree. It's like, well, the reality is most of us agree on good and evil when you get a big group of people agreeing upon it. As soon as you ask individually, you look at that soldier on a field, you know, they're fighting the Germans, you look at that one individual, maybe they look 20. It's like, is it good? You're doing a good thing killing that other kid? It's like, it's really hard to decipher that on your own going man to man. But as soon as you get the regiment and the military industrial complex tells you those are bad people, you need to kill them, you know, they're doing evil, then it's easier for us to justify. So again, context, you bring in the context, and then things aren't so dichotomous. It's the nuance. Now, does anybody have anything else? Because we've really pushed it. We were 5 minutes to 8. We have been going this whole time without any breaks. So is there anything else anybody wants to bring up before I introduce our sustained attention exercise?
I could do absence of no, but I feel like maybe what I can do is I do have something if everyone's okay with that. Otherwise, we can just go on and move on with the process. So what does everybody else think? Is it okay if I share one last thing? Cyril's
Uh, I'm okay with that, Macy, 100%.
cool with that, okay? Everybody else?
Yep, Cyril's giving thumbs up. We got, yep, okay. We got a
That's
shrug.
democracy for you, kids. And I'm just kidding.
The whole of us agree.
So, Maddie, go to page 195.
195 coming up.
Okay, so it starts with, so what begins in the right hemisphere's world? R-E-T. So what begins in the right hemisphere's world is sent to the left hemisphere's world for processing, but must be returned to the world of the right hemisphere, where a new synthesis can be made. Perhaps an analogy would be the relationship between reading and living. Life can certainly have meaning without books, but books cannot have meaning without life. Most of us probably share a belief that life is greatly enriched by them. Life goes into books and books go back into life, but the relationship is not equal or symmetrical. Nonetheless, what is in them not only adds to life, but genuinely goes back into life and transforms it, so that life as we live it in a world full of books is created partly by books themselves. This metaphor is not perfect, but it makes the point. In one sense, a book, like the world according to the left hemisphere, is a selective, organized, represented, static, revisitable, boundaried, frozen extract of life. It has taken something infinitely complex, endlessly interrelated, fluent, evolving, uncertain, never to be repeated, embodied and fleeting because alive, and produced something in a way very different that we can use to understand it. Though obviously far less complex than life itself, it has nonetheless brought into being an aspect of life that was not there before it. So the left hemisphere, like the book, can be seen as taking from the world as delivered by the right hemisphere, unconsidered life, and giving the life back enhanced. But on the shelf, the contents of the book are dead. They come back to life only in the process of being read, no longer static, boundaried, frozen. The contents of the book are taken up into the world where nothing is ever fixed or fully known, but always becoming something else. I take it that there is something that exists outside the mind. One has to have a starting point, and if you do not believe at least that, I have nothing to say, not least because, if you are right, you are not there for me to say it to. The relationship of our brains to that something, whatever it is that exists apart from ourselves, could be of four kinds. 1, no relationship at all, which returns us to solipsism, since my brain would be the sole source of everything I experience. 2, receptive, in the sense that, perhaps like a radio set, the brain picked up at least something of whatever it was from out there, and that became what is experienced. 3, generative, in the sense that the brain created at least something of the whatever it is that exists apart from ourselves. Or 4, reverberative, that is to say, both receptive and regenerative, both picking up, receiving, perceiving, and in the process making, giving, back, creating whatever it is that exists apart from ourselves, but includes ourselves. I am simply going to state that at this point that I adopt the last of these alternatives. Of course, which is right is a terribly important question for philosophy, but if such a thing is susceptible of proof, I can't prove it. All I can say is that all the evidence available to me as a living, thinking, experiencing human being leads me to that conclusion. So giving the argument of this book, it is both the hemispheres that are doing this giving and receiving and becoming part of it all out there, or just one. My view is that both the right and left hemispheres are involved in the giving and receiving process out of which the world we experience is created, but once again, not symmetrically. The right hemisphere appears to be the first bringer into being of the world, but what it brings into being can only inevitably be partial. The idea that our brains are perfectly adapted to bring into being for us everything that may exist in the universe, particularly that they could bring into being everything in the universe at one time, is patently ridiculous. To use the analogy of a radio, it can be tuned into only one wavelength at a time, and there will always be radio waves, not to mention the forms of waves that will never be able to be picked up. But this filtering, this restriction imposed on the right hemisphere is not just a limitation in the negative sense, any more than being able to transmit one program at any one time is a negative quality in a radio. Such limitation is a condition of its functioning at all. From it, something particular is permitted to come into being for us. The world as the right hemisphere delivers it to us. I will stop.
I don't know if I want to do sustained attention because then I have to pick something.
I would do
anybody-
sustained attention, but there's a really interesting squirrel outside, so I can't do it.
Okay. Does anybody have something for sustained attention? Something, or yeah, anything about today's discussion that really jumped out to them? We don't have to go around the room and do everybody, but if somebody has something that really called to them and really they enjoyed or completely didn't understand throughout this discussion, now's the time.
I really liked the little bit Macy just finished off with. I think it was actually a really good capstone considering the topic of the chapter is the primacy of the right hemisphere. But like near the last third of the chapter, McGilchrist does a really good job of giving a lot of credit where it's due to the left hemisphere. I love his analogy of reverberating, right? The give and take, the push and pull, how you always have to, no matter where a thing originates, whether it's out in the world, whether it's the right hemisphere that brings it into being, or you analyze it with the left hemisphere, you're still going to do the process of passing it back and forth and pinging back and forth. It's how your world comes into being for you, whether you like it or not. So you can try and demonstrate it differently, but there's a certain amount of grace for just the process that's going to happen regardless. And the right hemisphere understands it. So why it has hope in the left hemisphere, even with the risk of being betrayed.
One thing that was interesting to me, and I would have to explore a bit more, is the interplay between emotion and reason. Because from what I was able to grasp of this, the emotion goes to the reason, or yeah, the emotion is regulated by the reason. To me, it seems more to be an interplay between emotion and reason, as in reason can regulate emotion, and emotion can also regulate reason. I don't see it as a linear process, emotion, reason, action. It is like you in your last section talking about the reverberating. That made a lot of sense. It's exactly what's going on there. It's a reverberation between reason and emotion, reason and emotion. It's not a linear process. It's always going back and forth.
It is, but I think that's something that's needs to stay in the context is bear in mind your left hemisphere wants to betray the right hemisphere. Like, so you have a betrayer within you, and it is half of your brain. And it doesn't mean that it wants to betray you because it's malevolent. It can be seen as malevolent, which is fine, and you can break down how that manifests in the world. But you do got to bear in mind that the scorpion murders the frog 9 times out of 10, so to speak. And the constant answer is, well, it's in my nature. And the left hemisphere is going to do what the left hemisphere is going to do, whether we like it or not. So you do want to bring in that conscious choice. So it's like, yeah, the emotion can come in, and I agree with you. Whenever you talk about symbiosis, I'm going to agree with you. But we have to bear in mind what is the function of the left hemisphere in dealing with those emotions. And if you don't bear that in mind, then there's going to be a naivety that then manifests. And then you'll get the justification from the left hemisphere. And then all of a sudden you find yourself not just betrayed, but you've self-murdered in the process.
With respect to letting your emotions run rampant.
Yeah,
totally.
Because the thing is that the left hemisphere will so around our household we'll play around with like try to get the pings in the right order, because ad infinitum it's back forth. That's what the reverberation is. Yes. In a perfect world, but you're not that thing at all times. And so we would say, try to make sure that your master's in charge here, right, left, right. Otherwise you're left, right, lefting. And that's exactly what the left hemisphere wants. In fact, the left hemisphere would prefer just not to send it back, period. Because once it feels it has a grasp on it, it doesn't want to let go. Right. So that's a part of the emotional, that's what gets weaponized about us. That's what the oligarchy can count on when it comes to manipulating us. And unless we understand that magic trick, and we got to realize that that is our fallibility. That's what allows the continuation of this process that gets us murdered on mass levels, gets us enslaved to the Hall of Mirrors and the labyrinth, that the left hemisphere builds this system. Not the right hemisphere. Right hemisphere doesn't build a system. Left hemisphere builds systems. So just to keep that in mind.
Yeah, for sure. To keep these things in their proper perspectives and places.
I think that just like to quickly add on to that, and then I might go on to my sustained attention thing, is that reminded me of when he talks about the primacy of value, which we didn't touch on, but I think that I can kind of give a bit of what that is that when you're thinking of emotion, he said in effect, when he was describing it, he was saying that it's something that is almost fundamental kind of thing. And I feel like it's also something that is not entirely can be described because, or at least not in the way that my left hemisphere would attempt to do that thing. But I feel like, because even value is something that is fundamental, and that doesn't necessarily mean that it's something that's predetermined and set, because I feel like in some ways it has a way of finding itself, which sounds a little odd, but bear with me, because in his segment, if I can remember correctly, he said that value is not whatever I take it to be, and it's also not whatever we agree it to be, but it's I almost want to just straight up be like, it is. You know what I mean? And it's a living thing, and it's living, I think, through the what you were just describing with that reason and emotion relationship of like, that is the wavelength. You know what I mean? And so I think that I can actually relate this to my sustained attention thing, is that what I kind of have garnered a lot of this is that being uncomfortable and making room for that which you do not know. And when I'm relating this wavelength, right, and he talks about like even the last thing that I read about the radio and all that, right, it's like there's something that you take in and you receive, but there's nothing wrong with the restriction of what it is that you are transmitting and what it is that you are receiving, but you know damn well that you ain't getting it all. You know what I mean? And the minute that you feel like you do, you know that what you are is also because of the outside. So as within, so as without, as without, so as within. You know what I mean? And that's what I think that wavelength reciprocal process is, and we are literally embodying that, which is why it's so funny, because you can relate it to frequency. Like, well, why do we think we're a frequency? We literally act actually like we're a fucking frequency, which is so cool. But and lastly, for my additional sustain, is I just really wanted to give props to Nathan, because in the very beginning when you were asking about like, well, how does like one do intuitive right hemisphere things, right, and I thought throughout this entire process you were living and embodying that, like by listening, by engaging, by keeping open attention, by asking questions, you embodied exactly the thing that you were trying to figure out. So I just thought that was so cool, and it wasn't explicit, it was all implicit. So yeah.
That's good stuff. I didn't know that. Thanks.
That's funny. I'm glad you said that, Macy, because I didn't know how to put it into words, that I was very grateful for his presence. And I thought that earlier. I was like, he's embodying the thing he's questioning. But I'm glad you got to put that in perspective, and you got the words to say it before I did. You are better there.
He only asked the question because his left hemisphere was trying to figure out something that it can't do. But by demonstration, it just did.
And he kept letting it go.
Yeah, because the right hemisphere.
I want it.
You can't keep the right hemisphere down, no matter how hard they try. That's what gets the oligarchy pissed. We keep messing up their scheme because we have a right hemisphere, you morons.
That's good. Well,
it's a nice confidence thing.
Yes, for sure. Thank you everybody for coming. me and Macy will deliberate a date, and then I will email that out and send that to everybody. Otherwise, that concludes chapter 5.
Cool.
Thank
you.
Yes, thank you, everybody. Till
Ciao.
next time.
Bye.
Okay, see you guys. Bye.